give us your take on the headline numbers, legal bills aside.
Yeah, you're right. It's hard to put those aside necessarily because the settlement or the idea of a potential settlement is so massive. However, the revenue beat and the user numbers were not a surprise to us. I mean, Facebook has shown over the past year, and it has been a year since the first news of Cambridge Analytica came out, they've shown that they have been able to consistently grow revenues, grow users. The market for Facebook is doing well in terms of people using it, in terms of advertisers wanting to spend money there. So for us, that part was not a surprise. The big surprise, obviously, was the $3 billion that they're holding back for a potential FTC settlement.
And David, in context, that's a huge fine. I believe the highest fine ever in terms of a settlement between the FTC and a U.S. company was in the tens of millions of dollars. How serious is this?
Well, it's serious, and the key question is it a one-off? Going to what Deborah was saying, advertisers have no place to go beside Facebook, and as long as that remains the case, and as long as advertisers don't feel there's a serious associative risk, the execution is going to continue to be good because these people have proven they can execute. But there's something so disjunctive about the very moment that they announce a $3 billion set aside for a likely fine, that investors still bid the stock up 4 or 5%. You have to wonder when this company will begin to pay the piper for the fact that it is essentially losing social approval to operate. I don't think they are changing the way they operate fast enough to ensure that that's not going to happen.
So let's talk about that. I have a chart here in the Bloomberg which shows user growth over the last several years. Incredible growth, continuing monthly and daily active users, despite questions we ask every quarter about saturation in its most mature markets. And yet, when you talk about that, sort of social benefit or social motivation to use Facebook, you've got Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez telling Yahoo News today that she stopped using Facebook. She is a congresswoman who needs to use, presumably, social media, to further her own campaign, her own brand, and yet she says she's not using it because the costs are too high. Deborah, does that concern you?
Well, you know what? It doesn't concern me because she's still using Instagram. And honestly, Facebook owns Instagram. It's a very popular platform, and she's devoted all of her resources there. But I do want to get back to what David said, because I agree a lot with many of his points, particularly the fact that there's this settlement coming up. Advertisers and people who watch Facebook need to pay attention to what happens, what transpires, not just the amount of money that Facebook might have to pay, but what sorts of concessions Facebook might have to make in terms of changes to the way it stores user data, or the way it uses user data, the way that advertisers can use that data for targeted advertising. I mean, these are questions that I think advertisers and companies, people that watch Facebook, need to pay attention to, because this really is big news.
David, I saw you chuckle there when Deborah suggested, well, she's still using Instagram. I do want to say that she said she's scaling back on other social media. Do you think this is a bigger problem?
Well, it is a bigger problem. There's no question. There's a massive backlash against tech globally, which was largely precipitated by the behavior of this very company. And look at Europe, for example. Apple and Google have both already received massive multi-billion-dollar fines in Europe. Facebook never has, but Facebook could very, very easily start to face major legal problems there, too. There's certainly legal problems underway. None of them have resulted in massive fines yet. But, Zuckerberg has already begun to adopt this idea of this language of having a privacy-focused vision, which is nice. He better start delivering on it. If I could just quickly mention one thing that could happen. There's a possibility in the UK and probably elsewhere that new laws may begin to be imposed that no one under 18 can have any data gathered about them or be targeted in any way for digital advertising. If that happens, that's going to be a huge cost, because these companies, not just Facebook, don't really have an ability to differentiate between who's above and below 18 in many cases. So there's some very complex issues that Wall Street seems to be more or less disregarding, if you ask me.
So Europe certainly has been out front on tech regulation and much tougher on tech companies than the U.S. has thus far. But speaking to the privacy pivot that Zuckerberg is making, he did mention that in the earnings release, saying we're focused on building out our privacy-focused vision for the future of social networking, working collaboratively to address important issues around the internet. And speaking to that family of apps strategy, Deborah, that you pointed out, we estimate that more than 2.1 billion people now use Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, or Messenger every day on average, and around 2.7 billion people use at least one of our family of services each month. Now, as the company pivots to this privacy-focused future, nobody knows exactly what that's going to look like, exactly what Mark Zuckerberg has in mind. But Deborah, do you worry that that could impact growth as the way we use Facebook potentially and all these services becomes more private and changes?
Yeah, that is something that we're paying a lot of attention to. As a matter of fact, I'm researching an EMarketer report right now looking at some of those issues. But you're right, we don't know exactly what it's going to look like. Mark Zuckerberg and his staff are very, very smart people. They're certainly thinking about this and thinking about the way that marketers can reach people in these more private environments or these small group environments. But it's going to mean a change for advertisers. They're so used to using that news feed on Facebook to reach people, to get that mass reach, that this is definitely going to pose some challenges for them. I don't know how it's going to roll out, but I do think that Facebook is going to have a way to get around this. I also think, by the way, that Mark Zuckerberg is saying all the right things when it comes to addressing the FTC's concerns and the potential of a settlement, talking about privacy, talking about that they welcome regulation. I mean, these are all things that I think Mark Zuckerberg felt he needs to say in advance of potentially making this settlement with the FTC.
Now, the next 18 months are going to be a big test for Facebook as we gear up here in the United States for the 2020 election, and Facebook works to secure its platform from foreign and domestic meddling. Of course, we've seen the Mueller report come out in the last week, which did not make Facebook look good. The New York Times reported today that former Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen was very concerned about Russian interference, continued Russian attempts to threaten U.S. democracy in more advanced ways than the public may yet know. Meantime, you've got the son-in-law of President Trump saying the Russians just bought a couple of Facebook ads, quote unquote, a couple of Facebook ads. David, how much do you think this issue is going to affect Facebook over the next 18 months?
I can't believe it won't affect it quite a lot. I think when it comes to electoral interference on Facebook and foreign countries, interfering with the elections in other places, that isn't just a problem in the United States. So it could be a significant factor globally. Every country has elections and every country has enemies, and every country has now observed how effective it was when Russia interfered with the U.S. election on Facebook. So you got to believe it's an attractive target for a lot of people. Facebook clearly is working hard to prevent that. But I think, like I said, I think they are kind of in a weird place that has never been seen before. It's almost like the cigarette industry. It's getting very close to that, where they really, from the level of regulators and social critics and the press, they're sort of losing their license to operate in the way they always have, even as 2.1 billion people still go there every day, and who can't impeach that? That's great for them. But I wonder a lot about how quickly they can remedy these things. It's one thing to talk a good game, and Deborah's right. Mark Zuckerberg has totally changed the way he speaks about privacy. At the same time, lately we've heard 3 different instances, major instances, where passwords were stored inside Facebook in a completely unprotected way. This from a company that's, for some time before that, already been talking about how privacy-focused it wants to be. These things don't always go together.
Meantime, we've got some headlines crossing the Bloomberg right now. Bloomberg reporting that Facebook settling with the FTC does not include the ongoing investigations happening with the states, and that in total, this whole FTC probe could cost Facebook $5 billion. So more than that $3 billion they are now setting aside. Deborah, your reaction? I mean, $5 billion, that's a lot of money.
Yeah, it is, and that is it's. And I think to David's point earlier that there could be additional settlements in Europe and other places outside of the U.S. This is definitely something that I think Facebook is going to be dealing with over the course of this year, perhaps even into next year. We're going to be seeing a lot of changes in the way that Facebook will need to operate, and that will could potentially lead to changes in the way that marketers use Facebook, the way that people use Facebook, and the way that Facebook is perceived around the world. I mean, this really is a pretty momentous moment.
David, Facebook, also Bloomberg reporting in this story that Facebook is close to a settlement with the state, so at least making some progress toward finding common ground on what exactly Facebook did wrong. What's your take? Is this going to be a one-time thing? Or is this going to continue to happen?
I honestly think, in general, it's going to continue to happen because I think we've heard the rhetoric shift, but I think Facebook got caught unawares by a huge range of abuses of its system that it didn't have the governance to prevent. And it is now furiously backpedaling, trying to implement governance in areas of its business that didn't have governance before. I think that there are many parts of it that are going to be extremely hard to fix. So I would say the problems will continue. I still tip my hat to them for their execution of their business. On the other hand, they have to fix these problems. They do not have a choice.